The first shot rang out as Kathleen Cooper stepped into Redemption Springs, a town that had been waiting for her with bated breath and whispered judgments. The dusty main street fell silent, folks pausing mid-stride to gawk at the slender woman dressed in black, her honey-blonde hair tucked beneath a modest bonnet. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory had little patience for mysteries or the women who carried them. Kathleen kept her chin high, ignoring the stares that followed her as she made her way toward the boarding house at the edge of town. Her leather boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each determined step. Behind her, the stagecoach that had delivered her to this desert outpost was already rattling away, leaving her truly alone for the first time since departing Boston 3 weeks prior. "That's her," an old woman hissed to her companion as Kathleen passed. "Samuel Cooper's niece from back east. They say every man who's ever courted her has met with tragedy. Heard her fiancé in Boston drop dead at their engagement party," the other whispered back. "Just collapsed right at her feet, no explanation." Kathleen's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't break stride. She'd heard worse during the journey west. The rumors had traveled faster than the stagecoach that carried her. Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house proprietress, was waiting on the porch, her thin lips pressed together in obvious displeasure. She was a stern-looking woman with gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her weathered face. "Miss Cooper," she said curtly, "your uncle arranged for the room at the top of the stairs. $3 a week includes breakfast and supper. No gentlemen callers, no alcohol, no coming in after dark." "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway." "I understand," Kathleen replied, her Boston accent immediately marking her as an outsider. The older woman hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I run a respectable establishment, Miss Cooper. Any disturbances, and you'll have to find other accommodations." By disturbances, Kathleen knew exactly what the woman meant. Accidents, unexplainable incidents, the very things that had driven her from Boston to this remote frontier town where her late uncle had once owned property. "There won't be any trouble, Mrs. Holloway. You have my word?" The woman looked unconvinced but gestured for Kathleen to follow her inside. As they crossed the threshold, a small porcelain figurine fell from the mantelpiece and shattered on the hearth. Mrs. Holloway jumped, her hand flying to her throat. "Just the wind," Kathleen said quietly, though the windows were closed. In the saloon across town, Zachary O'Malley dealt another hand of poker, his weathered fingers moving with practiced precision across the green felt. At 32, he'd seen more of life than most men twice his age fought in the war, worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, and eventually found his place as owner of the Lucky Spur, the more reputable of Redemption Springs' 2 saloons. "Hear about the Cooper woman?" asked Sam Turner, the town's blacksmith, as he arranged his cards. Zach kept his expression neutral. "Heard she arrived on today's stage." "They say she's cursed," Frank Miller chimed in, the local shopkeeper leaning forward conspiratorially. "Back east, men who got close to her wound up dead or worse. Her own parents died in a house fire while she slept peacefully in the next room. Not a mark on her." "Sounds like gossip to me," Zach replied, disinterested. He'd learned long ago that small towns thrived on rumor and superstition. "You playing cards or telling tales, Frank?" But even as he spoke, Zach felt a prickle of curiosity. Redemption Springs rarely saw newcomers, especially unaccompanied women. Samuel Cooper had been a quiet man who kept to himself, tending his small ranch just outside town until his heart gave out 6 months earlier. Zach had done business with him occasionally, finding him fair but reserved. The news that his niece was coming to claim his property had stirred up the town like an anthill hit with a stick. "She's going to try to sell old Cooper's place," the blacksmith continued. "Good luck with that. Nobody in their right mind would buy land from a cursed woman." Zach collected his winnings without comment. He'd built his life around staying out of other people's business, focusing instead on running his saloon and the small horse ranch he'd established 2 years earlier. Superstitious gossip about some Eastern woman didn't concern him. The next morning, Kathleen rose early, determined to visit her uncle's property before the heat of the day set in. Mrs. Holloway provided a simple breakfast of biscuits and coffee, served with obvious reluctance and as little conversation as possible. Stepping out onto the main street, Kathleen immediately noticed how people hurried to the opposite boardwalk rather than pass directly by her. Two women actually crossed themselves when they caught sight of her. The weight of their fear and superstition hung heavier than the woolen dress on her back. The law office was her first stop. Sheriff Thomas Jenkins looked up from his desk when she entered, surprise flashing across his face before he collected himself. "Miss Cooper, what can I do for you?" "I need directions to my uncle's property," she said, "and information about his will." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Judge Parker handled the will. His office is down the street. As for the property, it's about 2 miles north of town. Just follow the main road until you reach the creek, then head east about a 1/4 mile. Can't miss it." As Kathleen turned to leave, the sheriff cleared his throat. "Miss Cooper, folks around here are, well, they're simple people with simple beliefs. They don't mean any harm. They believe I'm cursed, Sheriff Jenkins, that I bring death and misfortune. Do you consider that harmless?" Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. The lawman had the good grace to look embarrassed. "Give them time. They'll come around." "They never do," Kathleen replied softly, and departed. She was halfway down the street when a horse and rider came galloping into town, nearly colliding with her as she crossed to the judge's office. She stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding being trampled. "Watch yourself," the rider called out, pulling his mount to an abrupt halt. When he turned in his saddle to look at her, his expression changed from irritation to curiosity. Zachary O'Malley had not expected to encounter the subject of last night's gossip so directly. Up close, she didn't look cursed, just a slender young woman with intelligent hazel eyes and a determined set to her jaw. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with a natural beauty that needed none of the paint and powder the saloon girls relied upon. "My apologies, madam," he said, tipping his hat. "Didn't see you there." Kathleen studied him warily. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. Unlike most men she'd encountered in Redemption Springs, he met her gaze directly, without fear or suspicion. "No harm done," she replied, brushing dust from her skirt. "Though you might want to slow down when riding into town, Mr. O'Malley. Zachary O'Malley." He dismounted in one fluid motion. "And you must be Miss Cooper." "News travels fast." His mouth quirked up at one corner. "Small town, not much happens here worth talking about." "Except for cursed women from the East?" Zach had the decency to look slightly abashed. People talk. Doesn't mean they know anything worth hearing. Something in his direct manner made Kathleen relax slightly. "Well, Mr. O'Malley, since you nearly ran me down, perhaps you might make amends by pointing me toward Judge Parker's office?" "Better than that," he replied. "I'm headed there myself. I'll walk with you." They fell into step side by side, acutely aware of the stares following them from shop windows and boardwalks. Zach noticed Mrs. Peterson actually hurrying her children inside as they approached. "Don't mind them," he said quietly. "I'm quite used to it, Mr. O'Malley." "Used to being feared? That seems a heavy burden for someone so young." Kathleen glanced at him, surprised by his perception. "Perhaps I've earned their fear. Have you considered that?" "Have you?" She didn't answer, and they completed the short walk to the judge's office in silence. Once inside, Judge Parker, a portly man with bushy white sideburns, looked up from his desk with obvious surprise. "Miss Cooper, I wasn't expecting you until later this week," he said, rising to his feet. "The stage arrived earlier than anticipated," Kathleen replied. "I'd like to review my uncle's will and take possession of the deed to his property." The judge gestured for her to take a seat, then noticed Zach standing behind her. "Mr. O'Malley, I'll be with you shortly." "No rush," Zach replied, settling into a chair by the door. As Judge Parker shuffled through papers in a large cabinet, Kathleen remained rigid in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Zach watched her surreptitiously, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way she seemed to hold herself apart, as if expecting to be asked to leave at any moment. The judge finally located the relevant documents and returned to his desk. Everything is in order, Miss Cooper. Your uncle left his entire estate to you, the ranch, the livestock, and approximately $200 in the territorial bank across the street. He pushed several papers toward her. You'll need to sign here and here. The ranch is about 2 miles north of town. It's modest but solid. Samuel was a private man but well respected. Until he invited his cursed niece to join him, Kathleen said quietly. Judge Parker's face reddened. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. My uncle wrote to me a year ago, offering me a home after the incidents in Boston. He was the only family member who didn't believe the rumors. Now he's dead before I could even arrive. The judge cleared his throat uncomfortably. Samuel had a heart condition for years, Miss Cooper. His passing was entirely natural, I assure you. After Kathleen signed the necessary papers, the judge handed her a small brass key. This will open the main house. I should warn you that no one has been out there since your uncle's passing. It may require some attention. Thank you, Judge Parker. I'll manage. As she rose to leave, Zach stood as well. Judge, I'll come back later for those water rights papers. Seems Miss Cooper might appreciate an escort to her property. Kathleen turned to him sharply. That's not necessary, Mr. O'Malley. Maybe not necessary, but practical. It's a fair distance. The sun is climbing, and I'm headed that direction anyway. My ranch borders your uncle's property to the north. She hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to accepting help. Finally, she gave a small nod. Very well, thank you. Outside, Zach retrieved his horse from the hitching post. We can rent a wagon at the livery if you'd prefer to ride rather than walk. Walking is fine, Kathleen replied. I've been cooped up on stagecoaches for weeks. I could use the exercise. They set off, Zach leading his horse and matching his stride to Kathleen's more measured pace. As they passed the general store, the owner stepped outside to sweep the boardwalk, only to freeze at the sight of them. His broom clattered to the ground as he hurried back inside. Does it ever bother you? Zach asked after they'd left the last buildings of town behind them. The way people act? Kathleen walked with her eyes fixed on the horizon. It bothered me once. Now I've come to expect it. And have you ever done anything to earn such fear? She glanced at him, her expression guarded. You're very direct, Mr. O'Malley. Zach, he corrected. And yes, I find it saves time. Then I'll be equally direct. 3 men who courted me died under unusual circumstances. My parents perished in a house fire that somehow didn't spread to my room. My fiancée collapsed at our engagement party and never regained consciousness. Since then, I've been followed by incidents. Objects falling, glass breaking, unexplainable occurrences that happen in my presence. She delivered this information without emotion, as if reciting items on a shopping list. So you see, the good people of Redemption Springs have reason for their suspicion. Zach was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. Sounds like a run of terrible luck, not a curse. Kathleen actually laughed, a small surprised sound that seemed to catch her off guard. You may be the first person to say that to me since my uncle. I don't put much stock in curses, Miss Cooper. Kathleen, she offered in return. They continued in companionable silence, the Arizona landscape stretching around them vast and unforgiving, yet beautiful in its starkness. The heat of the day was building, and Kathleen was grateful when Zach suggested they pause in the shade of a large cottonwood tree beside the creek the sheriff had mentioned. Your uncle's place is just beyond that rise, Zach said, pointing east. It's not much to look at, but the land is good. Better water than most properties around here. Kathleen accepted the canteen he offered, taking a careful sip of the cool water. Did you know my uncle well? Well enough. He kept to himself mostly, but we did business from time to time. He was fair and honest, rare qualities out here. He was kind to me when others weren't, Kathleen said quietly. He wrote to me after the incident with my fiancée, offering me a home away from the whispers. Said the West was a place where a person could start fresh. That's true enough, Zach agreed. Most folks out here are running from something the law, bad memories, failed dreams. Nobody asks too many questions about what came before. Except when a supposedly cursed woman arrives. Kathleen pointed out with a wry smile. Zach shrugged. Give them time. They'll find something else to gossip about eventually. When they reached Samuel Cooper's property, Kathleen paused at the gate, taking in her new home. It was indeed modest, a small, sturdy cabin with a covered porch, a barn in need of paint, and a corral where 3 horses grazed listlessly. The surrounding land was mainly scrubby pasture with a vegetable garden gone wild beside the house. It's more than I expected, she said softly. Zach watched her face, seeing not disappointment but genuine appreciation. Your uncle worked hard on this place. Wasn't one for fancy improvements, but everything's solid and practical. As they approached the cabin, Kathleen withdrew the brass key from her reticule. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a simple interior, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and 2 doors that presumably led to bedrooms. I'll check the barn while you look around inside, Zach offered. Make sure everything's secure. Kathleen nodded gratefully, stepping into what was now her home. The air inside was stale but not unpleasant. Her uncle had lived simply a wooden table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, shelves lined with books that surprised her with their variety. She ran her fingers along their spines, finding works of philosophy, history, and poetry, alongside practical manuals on ranching and agriculture. In the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, she found evidence of preparation for her arrival: a freshly made bed with a colorful quilt, a small bureau with an attached mirror, and a vase on the windowsill, empty now, but clearly meant for flowers. The sight brought tears to her eyes. Her uncle had been expecting her, preparing for her, before his heart gave out. When Zach returned from inspecting the outbuildings, he found Kathleen standing in the main room, a framed photograph in her hands. Everything looks sound outside, he reported. The horses need better feed, and there's a leak in the barn roof, but nothing urgent. Kathleen nodded absently, still looking at the photograph, a formal portrait of her as a young girl standing beside her parents. He kept this all these years, she murmured. I didn't think anyone in my family had any reminders of me. Zach moved closer, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Your uncle mentioned you a few times, said you had a good head for figures and a kind heart. He was proud of you. She looked up at him, surprise evident in her expression. He said that? He did. Not a man for many words, your uncle. But when he spoke about you, there was real affection. Kathleen carefully placed the photograph on the mantel. Thank you for telling me that, and for your help today. Neighbors help neighbors out here, Zach replied simply. Speaking of which, I should get back to my own place. I've got horses that need tending. She walked him to the door. How do I go about getting supplies? I'll need food, seed for planting. I can take you into town tomorrow if you'd like, he offered. I need to go in anyway. Kathleen hesitated, clearly torn between her need for provisions and her reluctance to face the town's judgment again so soon. I wouldn't want to impose. No imposition, he assured her. I'll come by mid-morning. And Kathleen, he added as he stepped onto the porch, don't worry about the talk. It'll die down eventually. As Zach rode away, Kathleen remained on the porch, watching until he disappeared over the rise. For the first time since arriving in Redemption Springs, she felt a small spark of hope. Perhaps here, in this remote place, she could finally escape the shadow that had followed her for so long. The next few days established a routine of sorts. True to his word, Zach took Kathleen into town for supplies, enduring the stares and whispers with a stoic indifference that somehow made them easier to bear. The shopkeeper, Frank Miller, was reluctant to serve her until Zach fixed him with a steady gaze and mentioned casually that he might take his considerable business elsewhere if Miller couldn't accommodate all his neighbors. With food, seed, and basic household supplies secured, Kathleen set about making her uncle's cabin truly her own. She cleaned every surface, planted the garden with vegetables that would mature before winter, and spent hours with her uncle's books, learning about the land and climate of her new home. Zach stopped by every few days, ostensibly to check on a fence line or discuss water rights, but Kathleen suspected he was keeping an eye on her. She found she didn't mind. His visits were a welcome break from the solitude, and he treated her with a matter-of-fact kindness that asked nothing in return. A week after her arrival, Kathleen decided it was time to attend Sunday services. If she was to make Redemption Springs her home, she couldn't hide at the ranch forever. She dressed in her best blue dress, arranged her hair neatly beneath a modest bonnet, and set out on foot for town. The small white church at the edge of town was already filled when she arrived. As she slipped through the door, a hush fell over the congregation, heads turning to stare at the newcomer. Kathleen stood straight-backed, scanning the pews for an empty seat. None seemed available, or perhaps no one was willing to make room. Just as she was considering leaving, a deep voice spoke from behind her. "Miss Cooper, would you care to join me?" Zachary O'Malley stood in the aisle, gesturing to a space on the bench beside him. He was dressed in clean dark trousers and a white shirt, his usually unruly hair slicked back with water. He looked different, more civilized, but somehow less comfortable than in his everyday clothes. Whispers immediately erupted around them. Kathleen could almost hear the thoughts racing through the congregation's collective mind. Doesn't O'Malley know about her? Is he courting danger? The cursed woman will bring him to ruin. For a moment, Kathleen considered refusing. She had no right to draw him into her sphere of misfortune, but the quiet dignity in his expression, the simple human kindness of his offer, made refusal impossible. "Thank you, Mr. O'Malley," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "That's very kind." As she moved to sit beside him, Zach did something unexpected. He extended his hand to her, a deliberate public gesture that could not be misinterpreted. After a brief hesitation, Kathleen placed her gloved hand in his, allowing him to guide her to the pew. The collective gasp was audible throughout the church. Pastor Williams, who had been preparing his sermon notes at the pulpit, looked up in surprise at the disturbance. His eyes widened at the sight of Zachary O'Malley, one of the town's most respected citizens, despite his saloon ownership, holding hands with the woman everyone believed was cursed. Kathleen felt the weight of every stare as she settled beside Zach, who released her hand only after she was seated, but remained close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The message was unmistakable. He was publicly associating himself with her. Consequences be damned. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered as the pastor nervously called the congregation to prayer. "Yes, I did," Zach replied simply. The service passed in a blur for Kathleen. She heard little of Pastor Williams's sermon, distracted by the sensation of sitting openly among people for the first time in years without hiding or apologizing for her existence. Beside her, Zach sang the hymns in a surprisingly pleasant baritone, followed the scripture readings attentively, and occasionally glanced at her with a reassuring smile. When the service ended, Kathleen braced herself for the inevitable rush to leave people hurrying to avoid proximity to her. Instead, as she and Zach rose to depart, Pastor Williams approached them directly. "Miss Cooper, Mr. O'Malley," he said, his voice carrying through the still hushed church. "I'm pleased to see new faces in our congregation. I hope you'll join us for the community meal after services." Before Kathleen could form a polite refusal, Zach spoke. "We'd be delighted, Pastor, wouldn't we, Miss Cooper?" Trapped by courtesy and Zach's pointed look, Kathleen nodded. "Yes, thank you for the invitation." The community meal was held in the open area behind the church, where tables had been set up and laden with dishes brought by the congregation. As Kathleen and Zach approached, conversations faltered, but no one openly objected to their presence. "You're making quite a statement, Mr. O'Malley," Kathleen murmured as he led her to a table. "Just being neighborly," he replied, but there was a glint in his eye that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. They sat somewhat apart from the others, but not completely isolated. Zach filled a plate for each of them from the communal dishes, ignoring the concerned looks from some of the women who had prepared the food. Gradually, cautiously, a few of the braver souls approached their table. Sheriff Jenkins came first, tipping his hat to Kathleen and engaging Zach in conversation about a recent cattle sale. Then Judge Parker joined them briefly, inquiring about Kathleen's progress with her uncle's property. Even Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house owner, stopped by to ask stiffly if Kathleen was settling in well. None of them stayed long, and none openly welcomed her, but the mere fact that they acknowledged her existence without crossing themselves or whispering behind their hands felt like progress. As they were preparing to leave, a commotion near the dessert table caught everyone's attention. Little Sarah Miller, the shopkeeper's daughter, had climbed onto a chair to reach a pie and lost her balance. The chair toppled, sending the child tumbling toward the edge of the table where glass punch bowls were precariously stacked. Without thinking, Kathleen rushed forward, reaching the girl just as she fell. She caught Sarah before she hit the ground, cushioning her with her own body as they both tumbled onto the grass. The punch bowls wobbled but remained intact. For a moment there was absolute silence. Then Sarah looked up at Kathleen with wide eyes and said clearly, "Thank you, madam." Kathleen helped the child to her feet, brushing grass from her Sunday dress. "You're welcome, Sarah, but perhaps next time, ask someone taller to reach the pie for you." The girl nodded solemnly, then looked past Kathleen to where her father stood frozen in horror. Frank Miller rushed forward, snatching his daughter away and checking her frantically for any sign of harm. "Papa, the lady saved me from falling on the glass," Sarah protested as her father pulled her away. Miller looked at Kathleen, conflicting emotions battling across his face, gratitude warring with ingrained fear. Finally, he managed a tight nod. "Thank you, Miss Cooper." It wasn't much, but it was something. As Kathleen and Zach departed the church grounds a short time later, she felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, not acceptance, certainly, but perhaps the first crack in the wall of superstition that had surrounded her. "Well, that was eventful," Zach commented as they walked back toward her property. He had insisted on escorting her home, claiming it was on his way. "I suppose I should thank you," Kathleen said after they'd left the town behind. "What you did in church today, no one has ever stood beside me so publicly before." Zach shrugged, looking slightly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Seemed like the right thing to do. It was brave and foolish. You've lived here for years, built relationships and a business. Now you've associated yourself with the town pariah." "First," Zach replied, his tone light but his eyes serious, "you're not a pariah. You're a woman who's had more than her share of tragedy. Second, any friends who'd abandon me for showing basic human decency aren't friends worth having." Kathleen stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "Why are you doing this, Mr. O'Malley? Why risk your standing for someone you barely know?" Zach met her gaze steadily. "Because I know what it's like to be judged for things beyond your control, to have people look at you and see only what they fear or don't understand." There was a story there. Kathleen realized something personal that had shaped this man's unusual compassion. But before she could ask, he continued walking, and she fell into step beside him. "Besides," he added with a grin that transformed his serious face, "I've never much cared what people think of me. Drives Sheriff Jenkins crazy." The remainder of the walk passed in comfortable conversation about safer topics, the condition of the road, the likelihood of rain, the quality of the Sunday sermon. By the time they reached her gate, Kathleen felt more at ease than she had in years. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she offered impulsively. Zach hesitated, glancing at the sun's position. "I should get back to check on my stock, but perhaps another time?" "Of course. And thank you again, Mr. O'Malley." "Zach," he reminded her with a smile, "after causing a town scandal together, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Zach," she agreed, returning his smile. As he turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind swept across the yard, slamming the cabin door shut with such force that one of the hinges broke, leaving the door hanging askew. Kathleen froze, the familiar sick feeling washing over her. It was happening again, the unexplainable incidents that followed her everywhere, reinforcing the belief in her curse. Zach surveyed the damage with a practical eye. That door needed new hinges anyway. The wood's gone dry in this climate. He moved toward the cabin. I can fix it now if you have tools. His matter-of-fact response to what most would see as evidence of supernatural influence stunned Kathleen. You don't think it's unusual? A door slamming shut with no one touching it? I think it's wind, he replied simply, and old hardware. Nothing more sinister than that. As he set about repairing the door with tools from her uncle's shed, Kathleen watched him with growing curiosity. Either Zachary O'Malley was the most rational man she'd ever encountered, or he was deliberately choosing to ignore the obvious. Either way, his presence was like a balm to her battered spirit. The following weeks brought gradual changes to Kathleen's life in Redemption Springs. The town's attitude toward her remained cautious, but after her rescue of little Sarah Miller, outright hostility gave way to wary observation. She could now enter the general store without the owner rushing to serve her just to get her out faster. At the post office, people no longer vacated the building when she entered. And always there was Zach, stopping by her ranch with practical offers of help, occasionally inviting her to accompany him into town, treating her with a natural respect that slowly began to influence others. It wasn't friendship exactly, at least not in Kathleen's experience. There was something more simmering beneath the surface of their interactions, a current of awareness that neither acknowledged openly. One evening in late summer, Zach arrived at her cabin just as she was finishing supper preparations. He carried a small crate of vegetables from his garden and a book he thought she might enjoy, a collection of essays by Emerson that they had discussed during his last visit. Perfect timing, Kathleen said, gesturing to the stew bubbling on the stove. I always make too much. Will you stay? It wasn't the first time she'd invited him to share a meal, but something about the lengthening shadows and the cozy interior of the cabin made this evening feel different, more intimate. Smells too good to refuse, Zach replied, setting down the crate and book. They fell into their comfortable routine, Kathleen serving the food, while Zach sliced bread from the loaf he'd brought days earlier. They discussed the progress of their respective gardens, the price of cattle at the territorial market, and the upcoming harvest festival in town. Will you attend? Zach asked, referring to the festival. Kathleen hesitated. I'm not sure I'd be welcome. Things are changing, he pointed out. Mrs. Peterson actually greeted you yesterday at the mercantile. She did, Kathleen acknowledged with a small smile, though her daughter still hid behind her skirts. Progress comes in small steps, Zach said, reaching for another piece of bread. As he did, his sleeve caught the edge of his water glass, sending it toppling. Kathleen lunged to catch it, but too late the glass shattered on the wooden floor. Immediately, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. Kathleen drew back, her face paling as she stared at the broken glass. I'm sorry, she whispered. It happens around me. Things breaking, falling. Zach looked confused. Kathleen, I knocked the glass over. My sleeve caught it. But that's how it always begins, she insisted, her voice tight with fear. Something simple, easily explained, and then more incidents, worse ones, until... Until what? Zach asked gently. She couldn't meet his eyes. Until someone gets hurt. Or dies. Understanding dawned on his face. You truly believe you're cursed, don't you? That you somehow cause misfortune to those around you? How else do you explain what happened to my parents, to John, my fiancé, to every man who ever showed interest in me? Her voice rose slightly. 3 suitors, Zach. 3 men who courted me died in inexplicable accidents within weeks of declaring their intentions. Zach was silent for a moment, considering her words. Then he rose and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. Kathleen, look at me, he said quietly. When she finally raised her eyes to his, he continued, I don't believe in curses. I believe in coincidence, bad luck, and sometimes human malice, but not supernatural curses that follow innocent women across the country. Then how do you explain? I can't, he interrupted gently. I can't explain the tragedies you've experienced, and I'm truly sorry for them. But I do know this: I've spent more time with you than anyone in this town over the past 2 months. I've been in your home, shared your food, held your hand in public, and I'm still here. Healthy and whole. Kathleen stared at him, absorbing his words. It was true, Zach had defied all patterns from her past. The strange incidents still occurred around her: objects falling, unexpected gusts of wind, the occasional inexplicable noise, but nothing truly harmful had happened to him. Maybe it just takes time, she whispered. Maybe the curse is patient. Zach shook his head firmly. Or maybe there is no curse, Kathleen. Maybe you're just a woman who's had more than her share of tragedy, and somewhere along the way, you started believing what others said about you. He was still holding her hands, his touch warm and reassuring. Without thinking, Kathleen leaned forward slightly, drawn by the compassion in his eyes and the strength in his presence. The moment hung between them, filled with possibility and unspoken feelings. Then, slowly, deliberately, Zach closed the distance and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Kathleen didn't pull away. Instead, she responded with a tentative pressure of her own, her hands tightening around his. When they finally separated, Zach remained close, his forehead nearly touching hers. I've wanted to do that since the day I fixed your door, he admitted. I've wanted you to, Kathleen confessed, surprised by her own honesty. A smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. Well then, Miss Cooper, it seems we're in agreement on that matter. But as the initial wonder of the moment faded, fear crept back into Kathleen's heart. She withdrew her hands from his, rising to put distance between them. This can't happen, Zach. Whatever is between us, it can't go further. Because of the curse? His voice held no mockery, only gentle questioning. Because I couldn't bear it if something happened to you, she replied, her back to him as she gazed out the window at the gathering darkness. The others, it always started this way, with affection, with hope, and then Zach stood but didn't approach her. Kathleen, at some point, you have to decide whether to live your life believing in this curse or to take a chance on happiness. I can't make that decision for you, but I can tell you that I'm not afraid. You should be, she whispered. Well, I'm not, he said simply, and I'll be here when you're ready to stop being afraid too. He gathered his hat, pausing at the door. Think about the Harvest Festival. It would mean a lot to me if you came. After he left, Kathleen remained by the window for a long time, watching his figure disappear into the night. Her lips still tingled from his kiss, and her heart raced with conflicting emotions, joy at his declaration, terror at what it might mean. In Boston, she had learned to suppress any romantic feelings, to avoid even the most casual flirtation for fear of the consequences. But here, in this wild, open country, with this man who refused to see her as cursed or dangerous, old walls were crumbling. The broken glass still lay on the floor where it had fallen. With a sigh, Kathleen fetched a broom to sweep up the shards. As she worked, she considered Zach's words. Was it possible he was right? Had she internalized others' superstitions to the point that she believed them herself? The Harvest Festival was 3 days away. As she prepared for bed that night, Kathleen made a decision she would attend, not hiding in the shadows, but walking openly among her neighbors. And if Zachary O'Malley offered his hand again, she would take it. The morning of the festival dawned clear and bright, with the first hint of autumn crispness in the air. Kathleen spent extra time on her appearance, wearing a forest green dress she'd ordered from a catalog but never had occasion to wear in Boston. She arranged her hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun, and even added a touch of her mother's old perfume to her wrists. The town square had been transformed for the celebration. Tables laden with the bounty of local farms and ranches lined the perimeter. A space had been cleared in the center for dancing, with a small band setting up on a hastily constructed platform. Colorful bunting and paper lanterns decorated the buildings surrounding the square, giving Redemption Springs a festive air it had lacked during Kathleen's previous visits. She arrived alone, having decided to walk from her property rather than wait for Zach's invitation to accompany him. As she entered the square, the now familiar hush fell over those who noticed her, followed by hurried whispers. But this time, something was different. The whispers weren't all fearful. Some seemed merely curious or even mildly welcoming. Sarah Miller spotted her first, tugging on her father's sleeve and pointing. To Kathleen's surprise, the shopkeeper gave his daughter permission to approach with a small basket of apple tarts. "Papa says to thank you again for saving me," Sarah said, offering the basket, "and to welcome you to your first harvest festival." Kathleen accepted the gift with genuine pleasure. "Thank you, Sarah. The tarts look delicious." As the child scampered back to her father, Kathleen caught Frank Miller's eye. He gave her a small nod, not exactly friendly, but civil. Progress indeed. She found a place at one of the communal tables, where she was joined by Judge Parker and his wife, who made stilted but polite conversation. Mrs. Holloway stopped by briefly, commenting on Kathleen's dress with grudging approval. Even Pastor Williams made a point of welcoming her publicly, his wife offering a plate of fried chicken from their family's contribution. Kathleen was beginning to relax, to believe that perhaps Zach was right about the changing attitudes, when she realized he hadn't yet appeared. She scanned the growing crowd, looking for his tall figure, but saw no sign of him. "Looking for someone, Miss Cooper?" Sheriff Jenkins asked as he passed her table. "Mr. O'Malley," she admitted. "I thought he would be here by now." A shadow crossed the sheriff's face. "Haven't you heard? There was an accident at his ranch this morning. One of his hands came into town for the doctor." Kathleen felt the blood drain from her face. "What kind of accident? Is he hurt?" "Don't know the details," Jenkins replied, watching her reaction with interest. "Something about a horse and a broken fence. Doc Simmons rode out there a couple hours ago." Without another word, Kathleen gathered her skirts and rose from the table. The basket of tarts, her reticule, the festival itself all forgotten as she hurried toward the edge of town. Her heart pounding with dread. It was happening again, just as she'd feared, just as she'd warned him. She had allowed herself to care for Zach, had kissed him, had begun to hope, and now the curse had found him. The walk to Zach's ranch seemed interminable. By the time the buildings came into view, Kathleen's feet were blistered from her dress shoes, and her hair had come loose from its careful arrangement. None of that mattered. She needed to see him, to know the extent of the damage she had caused. As she approached the main house, larger and more established than her uncle's cabin, she saw Doc Simmons' buggy outside. The front door stood open, and she could hear men's voices from within. Taking a deep breath, she climbed the steps and entered without knocking. Zach was sitting in an armchair in the main room, his left arm bandaged and in a sling, his forehead sporting a nasty cut that had been stitched closed. He looked up as she entered, surprise and then pleasure lighting his face. "Kathleen, what are you doing here?" She stood frozen in the doorway, relief warring with guilt as she took in his injured but very much alive state. "The sheriff said there was an accident. I feared that I was dead?" Zach asked, his voice gentle with understanding. "It takes more than a spooked horse and a broken fence rail to kill me, I'm afraid." Doc Simmons turned at her entrance, nodding in recognition. "Miss Cooper, I was just finishing up here. Mr. O'Malley has a broken arm and a nasty gash, but nothing that won't heal with time and rest." "It was my fault," she whispered, still standing in the doorway as if afraid to come closer. "I knew this would happen." Zach shook his head firmly. "This had nothing to do with you, Kathleen. My new stallion got spooked by a rattlesnake, broke through the corral fence and dragged me a few yards before I could free my foot from the stirrup. Bad luck, but ordinary bad luck that could happen to any rancher." "You don't understand." "No, you don't understand," he interrupted, his voice stronger now. "This isn't some supernatural punishment for kissing you. It's just life on a ranch. Accidents happen, people get hurt sometimes. It has nothing to do with curses or fate or anything else." Doc Simmons glanced between them with raised eyebrows, but had the good sense not to comment. He gathered his supplies, gave Zach instructions for caring for his wounds, and took his leave, nodding politely to Kathleen as he passed. When they were alone, Zach patted the seat of the sofa nearest his chair. "Come sit down. You look like you've walked all the way from town." "I did," she admitted, finally moving from the doorway to perch on the edge of the sofa. "You left the Harvest Festival to check on me?" There was something warm in his voice, something that made her meet his eyes despite her fear. "I had to know if you were all right." Zach smiled, reaching out with his uninjured arm to take her hand. "I'm touched by your concern, Kathleen. But I need you to hear me. This accident had nothing to do with you or any curse. Ranch work is dangerous. I've had worse injuries before I ever met you." She wanted desperately to believe him. "The timing, though, is coincidental," he finished firmly. "Nothing more." They sat in silence for a moment, his hand warm around hers. Finally, Kathleen spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was so afraid when the sheriff told me. All I could think was that it was happening again, that I'd lost someone else. She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Someone else you care about?" Zach supplied gently. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Well, you haven't lost me," he assured her. "I'm right here, a bit battered, but very much alive and still caring about you too." The relief that flooded through her was overwhelming. Kathleen felt tears welling in her eyes and blinked rapidly to contain them. "Now," Zach continued, his tone deliberately lighter, "since we've both missed the festival, perhaps you'd do me the honor of staying for supper. My cook makes an excellent beef stew, and I find I'm in need of pleasant company to distract me from my injuries." Kathleen hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd like that." Supper that evening was a quiet affair, served by Zach's housekeeper, Mrs. Daniels, who regarded Kathleen with curious but not unfriendly interest. They ate in the dining room, Zach somewhat awkward with his injured arm, but insisting he needed no help. Their conversation carefully avoided both his accident and the subject of curses, focusing instead on books they'd both read, their childhoods in different parts of the country, and their hopes for the coming winter. By the time the meal ended, Kathleen felt almost normal, as if they were simply a man and woman enjoying each other's company without the shadow of superstition hanging over them. "I should return home," she said reluctantly as Mrs. Daniels cleared the dessert plates. "It's getting late." "I'd offer to escort you, but—" Zach gestured to his injured arm with a rueful smile. "I'll be fine," Kathleen assured him. "It's not far, and the moon is bright tonight." As she rose to leave, Zach caught her hand once more. "Kathleen, I meant what I said earlier. This accident doesn't change anything between us. I still care for you, and I'm still not afraid of any supposed curse." She looked down at their joined hands, then back at his earnest face. "I'm trying to believe that, Zach. It's just difficult after so many years of evidence to the contrary." "Then let me give you new evidence," he said simply. Give us a chance to prove that life can be different here." The hope in his eyes was impossible to resist. Kathleen found herself nodding. "I'll try." The weeks that followed tested Kathleen's resolve to believe in possibility rather than curses. As Zach's arm healed, their relationship deepened, cautious but steady. He visited her cabin often, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book, a jar of honey from his hives, once a kitten from a litter born in his barn. She, in turn, began to join him for Sunday services regularly, their presence together gradually becoming unremarkable to the townspeople. There were still incidents, unexplainable gusts of wind, objects falling without apparent cause, strange noises in the night. But as Zach remained unaffected, Kathleen slowly began to separate these occurrences from her feelings for him. Perhaps they were simply coincidences, as he insisted, or perhaps if there was a curse, it didn't extend to him for some reason. As autumn deepened toward winter, the town's attitude toward Kathleen continued to thaw. The harvest had been good, cattle prices were up, and no disasters had befallen Redemption Springs since her arrival. Even the most superstitious began to wonder if they had misjudged Samuel Cooper's niece. Thanksgiving approached, bringing with it preparations for the town's annual communal feast. To Kathleen's surprise, she received a formal invitation from the church committee, requesting that she bring a dish to share. "It's a significant step," Zach commented when she showed him the invitation. They were sitting on her porch, watching the sunset paint the desert landscape in gold and crimson. "They wouldn't ask you to contribute food if they still thought you were cursed." Kathleen smiled, allowing herself to feel a tentative happiness. "I think I'll make my mother's cranberry relish. It was always popular at home." "See, you're becoming part of the community," Zach said, his uninjured hand finding hers. His arm was still in a sling, though Doc Simmons had promised he could remove it in another week if the healing continued well. "Thanks to you," she replied. "If you hadn't taken my hand that day in church, you would have found your place eventually," he assured her. "You're too strong and too kind to be an outsider forever." The sincerity in his voice warmed her more than the woolen shawl around her shoulders. Over the past weeks, Kathleen had come to recognize that what she felt for Zachary O'Malley went far beyond gratitude or friendship. She was falling in love with him, his quiet strength, his unwavering support, his refusal to see her as anything but a woman worth knowing. The thought still frightened her, but not as much as before. Each day that passed without tragedy befalling him chipped away at her belief in the curse that had defined her for so long. As the light faded from the sky, Zach rose to leave, as he always did before full dark. "Will you come to the saloon tomorrow evening?" he asked. "Some of the local ranchers are organizing a small celebration for the cattle drive returns. Nothing rowdy, I promise." Kathleen hesitated. She had yet to visit Zach's business, partly from lingering propriety and partly from fear of how the regular patrons might react to her presence. "You don't have to," he added quickly, seeing her uncertainty. "I just thought it might be nice to show you another part of my life." Put that way, how could she refuse? "I'll come," she decided, "for a short while." The Lucky Spur was unlike any establishment Kathleen had entered before. The main room was larger than she expected, with a long bar along one wall, tables scattered throughout, and a small raised area at the back where a piano player provided lively tunes. Oil lamps cast a warm glow over the polished wood and brass fixtures, and the air was thick with the scents of whiskey, tobacco, and humanity. Despite Zach's assurances about the nature of the gathering, Kathleen felt distinctly out of place as she stepped through the bat-wing doors, her dark blue dress and neat appearance contrasting sharply with the more colorful attire of the few women present, clearly saloon girls rather than respectable townsfolk. Zach spotted her immediately, breaking off his conversation with a group of weather-beaten men to come greet her. His smile of genuine pleasure at her arrival eased some of her discomfort. "You came," he said, taking her hand. "Let me introduce you to some friends." The friends turned out to be cattle buyers from Tucson and local ranchers celebrating a successful drive. They regarded Kathleen with varying degrees of curiosity, but Zach's obvious respect for her kept their manner cordial. She was offered a glass of sherry, which she accepted mainly to have something to do with her hands, and found herself drawn into conversations about cattle prices and the coming winter. To her surprise, Kathleen actually enjoyed herself. The atmosphere was rowdier than she was accustomed to, but there was an honesty to the interactions that she found refreshing after Boston's rigid social constraints. These men and women spoke their minds, laughed openly, and seemed to judge others based on their actions rather than their reputations. As the evening progressed, the piano player began a waltz, and several couples moved to the small space cleared for dancing. Zach, his arm finally free of its sling, though still held somewhat gingerly, approached Kathleen with a questioning look. "Would you honor me with a dance, Miss Cooper?" She hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd be delighted, Mr. O'Malley, though we should be careful of your arm." "Worth the risk," he replied with a grin that made her heart flutter. As they joined the other dancers, Kathleen was acutely aware of the eyes following them. Not hostile stares, as she had once feared, but curious and even approving glances. Word had spread about Zach's interest in the cursed woman, and his continued good health despite their association had begun to change minds. They moved together well, Zach leading confidently despite his recent injury. Kathleen found herself relaxing into the dance, enjoying the sensation of being held in his arms in this public yet intimate way. "You're a fine dancer, Miss Cooper," he murmured, close enough that she could feel his breath warm against her cheek. "My mother insisted on lessons," she replied. "Said a lady should be accomplished in the social graces, regardless of whether she had opportunity to use them." "A wise woman." "She was," Kathleen agreed, a familiar pang of grief softened by the passage of time. "I think she would have liked you." Zach's eyes warmed at this admission. "I would have been honored to meet her. And your father." They continued dancing, the conversation flowing easily between them. As the waltz ended, Zach didn't immediately release her hand, instead drawing her slightly closer. "Kathleen," he said quietly, his voice serious despite the revelry around them, "there's something I want to ask you." Her heartbeat quickened. "Yes?" Before he could continue, a commotion at the bar drew their attention. Two Cowboy strangers passing through town had begun arguing over a card game. As Zach and Kathleen watched, the dispute escalated rapidly, voices rising in anger. "Excuse me," Zach said reluctantly. "I need to handle this before it gets out of hand." He moved swiftly toward the confrontation, his expression shifting from tender to authoritative. Kathleen watched as he positioned himself between the arguing men, his voice too low for her to hear, but his posture commanding respect. For a moment, it seemed the situation was under control. Then, one of the Cowboys reached for his gun. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. As the man's hand moved to his holster, a kerosene lamp hanging above the bar inexplicably detached from its hook, crashing down onto the counter. Glass shattered, oil splashed, and flames erupted instantly, distracting everyone in the vicinity. In the confusion, the armed Cowboy stumbled backward, his gun discharging into the ceiling rather than at Zach or his opponent. The fire spread quickly across the bar, patrons scattering in alarm as Zach shouted orders for water and blankets. Kathleen stood frozen, horror washing over her as she witnessed what seemed like irrefutable proof of her curse. She had entered Zach's domain, had danced in his arms, had allowed herself to hope, and now his livelihood was literally going up in flames. The next minutes were chaos as the saloon patrons and townspeople formed a bucket brigade from the nearby well. Kathleen found herself working alongside others, passing buckets and helping to evacuate the building. By the time the fire was extinguished, the bar and one wall had sustained significant damage, though the structure itself remained sound. As the immediate danger passed, Kathleen slipped away from the crowd, unable to face Zach with the weight of guilt crushing her heart. She hurried back to her cabin, tears blurring her vision as she packed essentials into a small valise. She had been foolish to believe she could escape her fate, foolish to risk Zach's life and property for her own selfish desire for normalcy. By morning, she would be gone back east, or perhaps further west to California. Somewhere far from Redemption Springs and the man who had almost made her believe in second chances. She was so focused on her packing that she didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats, didn't realize anyone had arrived until a knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, Zach stood on her porch, his face smudged with soot but his eyes clear and determined. "You're leaving," he said immediately, taking in the open valise on her table. "I have to," she replied, stepping back to allow him entry but maintaining distance between them. "After tonight, how can you deny the curse is real?" "Your saloon is insured and can be repaired," he interrupted. "No one was seriously hurt, which is what matters." "This time," Kathleen said, wrapping her arms around herself as if for protection. "But what about next time, or the time after that? Zach, I can't bear to be the cause of your destruction." Zach crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her shoulders in his hands and forcing her to look at him. "You are not the cause of anything, Kathleen. The lamp fell because the hook was old and weakened. The fire spread because there's enough spilled whiskey in that bar to fuel a locomotive. This was an accident, nothing more. She shook her head, tears threatening again. It's always nothing more until someone dies. I can't take that chance with you. That's not your decision to make, Zach said firmly. It's mine. And I choose to take the chance because what I feel for you is worth any risk. His declaration hung in the air between them, momentous and impossible to ignore. Kathleen stared up at him, wanting desperately to believe. What you feel for me, she echoed softly. Zach's expression softened, his hands gentling on her shoulders. I love you, Kathleen. I think I have since that first day when you stood in the street and questioned my riding skills. I love your courage, your kindness, your determination to stand tall despite everything you've endured, and I refuse to let some superstitious nonsense keep me from spending my life with you. Kathleen felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. In all her imaginings, she had never dared to hope for such a declaration, had never allowed herself to believe that someone could love her without reservation or fear. Zach, Before you answer, he interrupted, there's something I need to show you. He released her shoulders to reach into his vest pocket, withdrawing a folded piece of paper that he handed to her with uncharacteristic hesitation. I received this 2 weeks ago, he explained as she unfolded what proved to be a telegram. I've been making inquiries back east about your history. Kathleen scanned the message, her confusion growing as she read the terse lines from a law enforcement official in Boston. Investigation confirms deaths of Cooper suitors suspicious. Evidence points to poisoning. Primary suspect Gordon Blackwell, cousin and beneficiary if Miss Cooper remained unmarried. Further details to follow. I don't understand. Your cousin Gordon, Zach said gently. Did he stand to inherit if you never married? Kathleen's mind raced back through family connections and arrangements. My father's estate. Yes, there was a provision. If I remained unmarried by my 30th birthday, Gordon would receive a substantial portion that was otherwise designated as my dowry. Her eyes widened as comprehension dawned. Are you suggesting Gordon killed my suitors? That he was responsible for all of it? Not all, Zach clarified. The house fire appears to have been genuinely accidental. But the 3 suitors, your fiancé, the telegram confirms they were poisoned with a substance that mimics heart failure, and Gordon was present at each death. Kathleen sank into a chair, the telegram trembling in her hands. I never suspected. He was always so solicitous after each tragedy, offering comfort, discouraging me from new attachments, for my own protection. He created the narrative of the curse, Zach said, kneeling beside her chair. And when others began to believe it, it served his purpose even better. If you believed yourself cursed, you'd never marry, and he would eventually gain your inheritance. The revelation was overwhelming, shifting the foundation of Kathleen's understanding of her own life. If Zach was right, if the deaths had been murder rather than supernatural retribution, then she had been living in fear of a curse that never existed. The other incidents, though, she said, struggling to reconcile this new information with her experiences, the objects falling, the strange occurrences. Some coincidence, some suggestion, Zach replied. Once you believe something strongly enough, you notice every incident that confirms it and dismiss those that don't. And after a while, others expect strange things to happen around you, so they attribute ordinary accidents to your presence. It made a terrible kind of sense. Kathleen thought of all the years spent in isolation, all the relationships she had denied herself out of fear. If this is true, she said slowly, then I'm not cursed. I'm just ordinary. Zach smiled, taking her hands in his. There's nothing ordinary about you, Kathleen Cooper. Cursed or not, you're the most extraordinary woman I've ever known. And if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant ring with a single diamond. I was going to ask you tonight at the saloon before we were interrupted. I had it all planned, not exactly as romantic as I had hoped, but it's perfect, Kathleen whispered, hardly daring to believe this moment was real. Kathleen Cooper, will you marry me? Will you let me help you build a life free from fear and superstition right here in Redemption Springs? For one terrible moment, doubt threatened to overwhelm her. What if the telegram was wrong? What if the curse was real after all? But looking into Zach's eyes, seeing the love and certainty there, Kathleen made her choice. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger as she repeated, "Yes, Zachary O'Malley, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. The wedding was planned for the first Sunday in December, just 3 weeks away. Word spread quickly through Redemption Springs. Zachary O'Malley was marrying Kathleen Cooper, curse or no curse. To Kathleen's surprise, the news was met with more congratulations than consternation. The telegram's revelations about Gordon Blackwell had been shared discreetly with town leaders, and the changing narrative about Kathleen's past spread almost as quickly as the original rumors had. The lucky spur was repaired in record time, thanks to the efforts of townspeople who now saw its owner as a man brave enough to defy superstition for love. Mrs. Holloway offered to host a small reception at the boarding house after the ceremony. Frank Miller donated fabric for a wedding dress, which the town's seamstress offered to make at no charge. Even Sheriff Jenkins stepped forward, offering to give the bride away in the absence of male relatives. For Kathleen, the weeks leading to the wedding were a revelation. People who had once crossed the street to avoid her now stopped to chat about wedding preparations. Sarah Miller asked if she could carry flowers in the ceremony, a request Kathleen happily granted. Pastor Williams visited her cabin to discuss the service, treating her with the same respect he showed any prospective bride. The most significant moment, however, came the Sunday before the wedding. As Kathleen and Zach entered the church together, a sight the congregation had grown accustomed to over the past months, Pastor Williams asked them to remain standing while he addressed the gathered townspeople. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying to the back pews, "next week we will witness the union of two beloved members of our community. But before that joyous occasion, I feel compelled to acknowledge a wrong that needs righting." Kathleen tensed, uncertain of where this was heading. Beside her, Zach squeezed her hand reassuringly. "When Miss Cooper arrived in our town, many of us, myself included, were quick to judge based on rumor and fear rather than Christian charity," the pastor continued. "We allowed superstition to override the command to love our neighbors. For this, I ask Miss Cooper's forgiveness, and I invite those who share my regret to do the same." A murmur ran through the congregation. Then, to Kathleen's astonishment, people began to stand, first Mrs. Holloway, then Frank Miller and his wife, followed by the blacksmith, the postmaster, and others, until nearly the entire church was on its feet. "We were wrong," Mrs. Holloway stated plainly, "and we're sorry for it." Tears filled Kathleen's eyes as she looked out at the community that had feared her and now sought her pardon. "There's nothing to forgive," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "You believed what you thought was true, as did I." After the service, as they walked home together, Zach asked what she was thinking. "I'm thinking about how different my life might have been if I'd come west sooner," she admitted. "If I'd escaped the shadow of those deaths before the idea of the curse became so firmly rooted in my mind." "We can't change the past," Zach reminded her gently, "but we can decide what story we tell ourselves about it and how we let it shape our future." On their wedding day, snow dusted the ground around the church, the first of the season, and an unusual sight in that part of Arizona. The townspeople declared it a good omen, a fresh, clean beginning for the couple. Kathleen wore a simple dress of ivory satin with lace at the collar and cuffs, her honey blonde hair arranged in a crown of small white flowers. As Sheriff Jenkins escorted her into the church, she kept her gaze fixed on Zach, standing tall and handsome at the altar in a new black suit. The church was filled to capacity, not with fearful onlookers, but with neighbors and well-wishers. Even Doc Simmons had closed his practice for the morning to attend, sitting prominently in the front pew. Pastor Williams conducted the service with genuine warmth, speaking of love's power to overcome obstacles and fear. When he asked who gave this woman in marriage, Sheriff Jenkins responded clearly, "She gives herself with the blessing of this community." As Kathleen and Zach exchanged vows, their voices strong and sure, a beam of winter sunlight broke through the stained glass window, casting rainbow colors across the altar. Later, some would claim it was the final lifting of the curse. Kathleen preferred to see it as nature's blessing on a union founded in trust rather than fear. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Zach took Kathleen's hand just as he had that first Sunday and turned to face the congregation. Together, they walked down the aisle and into their future, leaving whispers of curses firmly in the past. The reception at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house was festive but modest, with food contributed by various townspeople and music provided by the piano player from the Lucky Spur. Kathleen moved among her new neighbors with growing confidence, accepting congratulations and well wishes with genuine pleasure. As the afternoon waned, she found herself standing beside Zach on the boarding house porch, watching the winter sun begin its early descent. "Happy Mrs. O'Malley?" he asked, his arm around her waist. The name still sounded new and wonderful to her ears. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "Then may I suggest we make our exit? I have a surprise waiting at home." Home was now Zach's ranch house, where Kathleen had moved her few possessions the day before. Her uncle's cabin would be rented to one of Zach's ranch hands and his young family, ensuring the property remained in good care. When they arrived, Kathleen gasped at the transformation of the main room. A fire blazed in the hearth, casting warm light over new curtains at the windows and a colorful quilt on the sofa, wedding gifts from the women of the town. On the mantelpiece stood the photograph of Kathleen with her parents, now joined by a formal portrait of Zach in his younger days, and a vacant space clearly meant for a wedding portrait. "It's perfect," she said, turning to embrace her husband. "Everything is perfect." Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Zach asked softly, "Any regrets? About marrying a saloon owner with a questionable past?" Kathleen propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at his face in the moonlight filtering through the window. "Your past made you who you are, just as mine shaped me." "I wouldn't change either." He reached up to touch her cheek. "You know, when I first saw you in the street that day, I thought you looked like someone who needed a friend. I never imagined you'd become my wife." "And I never imagined I'd be allowed to love someone without fear," she replied. "You gave me that gift, Zach. You and this town." "The town that once whispered you were cursed," he reminded her with a smile. "Until a stubborn cowboy took my hand in church for all to see," she finished, leaning down to kiss him. "And changed everything." Epilogue. 5 years later. The spring fair in Redemption. Springs had become an annual tradition, growing larger each year as the town prospered. Tables lined the main street displaying crafts, preserves, and baked goods from local families. Children raced between exhibits, their laughter mingling with the music from a small band set up near the newly constructed town hall. Kathleen O'Malley supervised the judging of fruit preserves. Her 3-year-old daughter, Eliza, perched on her hip, while her 5-year-old son, Samuel, helped arrange ribbons for the winners. At 32, Kathleen had fully embraced her role as a respected member of the community, wife to one of the town's most successful businessmen, mother to 2 lively children, and treasurer of the Ladies' Aid Society. The feared curse was now nothing more than an occasional joke among old-timers, a story told with smiles rather than whispers. Gordon Blackwell had been arrested in Boston and eventually convicted of multiple murders. His scheme to gain Kathleen's inheritance exposed thanks to Zach's persistent inquiries and the Boston authorities' thorough investigation. "Mama, look!" Eliza pointed excitedly as Zachary approached through the crowd, leading a small pony with Samuel's friend Tom Miller perched proudly on its back. Zach had aged well in the 5 years since their wedding, the touch of silver at his temples only adding to his distinguished appearance. The Lucky Spur had expanded to include a respectable hotel, and his horse ranch was now among the most successful in the territory. But his greatest pride, as he often declared, was his family. "There's my beautiful wife," he said, leaning in to kiss Kathleen's cheek. "Mrs. Holloway says your blackberry preserves are the clear winner this year, but she's pretending to deliberate to maintain suspense." Kathleen laughed, shifting Eliza to her other hip. "That sounds like Mrs. Holloway. She's taken her role as head judge very seriously since Pastor Williams appointed her." Zach took their daughter, lifting her high above his head to her squealing delight. "What do you think, Eliza? Is Mama's blackberry jam the best in Arizona territory?" "Yes," the little girl declared loyally. "The bestest ever!" Samuel, overhearing, abandoned his ribbon duties to join them. "Can we go see the new foal at Uncle Frank's stable, Pa? He said I could help name it." "After the judging," Kathleen promised, "and only if you finish helping with the ribbons first." As Samuel raced back to his assigned task, Kathleen and Zach exchanged a look of shared contentment. Their journey from strangers to spouses, from outsiders to integral parts of the community, had not always been smooth. There had been challenges: the difficult birth of Samuel, a drought that threatened the ranch 2 years earlier, occasional flare-ups of superstition when unexplained incidents occurred. But through it all, their commitment to each other and their belief in possibilities rather than limitations had carried them through. "I was thinking," Zach said as they watched their son carefully arranging blue ribbons, "we should host the town's Independence Day celebration at the ranch this year. We have the space, and with the new pavilion finished—" "That's a wonderful idea," Kathleen agreed. "We could have games for the children, dancing in the evening." Her thoughts were interrupted by Sarah Miller, now a poised young woman of 15, hurrying toward them with excitement. "Mrs. O'Malley, your preserves won first prize. Mrs. Holloway is about to make the announcement." As Kathleen handed Eliza back to Zach and hurried to accept her blue ribbon, she reflected on the fullness of her life now, the love of her husband, the joy of her children, the acceptance of a community that had once feared her. The whispers that had followed her for so long had been replaced by calls of greeting, invitations to social gatherings, requests for her recipes and gardening advice. Later that evening, as they put their children to bed in the home they had built together, Zach pulled Kathleen into his arms. "Happy?" he asked, just as he had on their wedding day. She smiled up at him, her heart full. "Completely. And grateful every day for the stubborn cowboy who wasn't afraid to take my hand." "Best decision I ever made," he replied, kissing her softly, "and one I'd make again every day for the rest of our lives." Outside their window, Redemption Springs settled into the peaceful quiet of a spring evening, its people connected by the bonds of community and shared history, including the story of a woman once whispered to be cursed, until love and courage revealed the truth that had always waited beneath the surface, that every life deserves a second chance, and every heart the opportunity to love without fear.